Welcome. It's good to see you. There are more coming, and it's always that tug between fellowship and coming to education. Back in January, there was an announcement in the New York Times that I think took a whole lot of people in the church off guard, is that fair to say, about a small group of leaders in the world denomination of the United Methodist Church who had gotten together to formulate protocols of separation. And they used words that I'm sure Fran will go over, like grace, gracious, what's the name of it? You'll do it. I knew you would. Since February of 2019, when the special General Conference was held, this congregation has formulated a task force to basically look at what's happening in the development of the denomination and to make recommendations to the larger congregation as to what it is to do. One of the major things that we did was to withhold our apportionments in resistance or protest as to what happened. In June, this annual conference decided that it would split out the apportionments, and so that the largest part of our apportionment really goes to mission in Wisconsin and the rest to the general church and the jurisdictional church. And so we decided at that point to release and pay that part of the apportionment, and we continue to do this. That goes to Wisconsin and escrow the rest, and our finance people are very careful to make sure that that gets escrowed every month. And so we decided that we needed to get us together, and Fran graciously, because he studies these matters in a way that I give it just cursory attention, you give it very careful attention. And so we are blessed to have Fran Diener with us this week. He will speak for a little over a quarter of an hour, and then there'll be question and answer. Next week, Steve Ziekoff, who led the delegation last time and has been part of this for a long time, and Jessica Goebel, who is in the delegation, will be here. So it's a two-part series. Fran, it's yours.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I don't do this alone. I'd like to first ask the other members of the task force to stand so that you know who else is on this task force. And thank you for your service. Okay, you ready? We'll walk through the articles of the protocol, and then after we present it, we'll open it up for questions. So if you can hold those to the end, please. This is dry legislative stuff. I can't make this exciting. And, a quick reminder that despite some news reports to the contrary, nothing has happened yet. Nothing has happened yet. And nothing has been approved. The UMC has not yet split. General Conference meets in May 5th through the 15th, and that is where the lay and clergy delegates elected by their annual conferences will make all decisions. I'd like to begin by briefly sharing the origin of the protocol, for it really began with a meeting called by Bishop John Yambasu of the Sierra Leone Episcopal area. And he called together 15 people, 5 traditionalists, 5 centrists, and 5 progressives, and they met in Chicago back in July. And those in attendance agreed that 2 persons from each of those constituencies, as well as 2 Central Conference bishops, would continue to meet with a mediator. The Central Conferences are those United Methodist churches outside the United States. Names of potential mediators were submitted, and in the end, Mr. Kenneth Feinberg volunteered his time. Mr. Feinberg is not United Methodist, he's Jewish, but stated that he had a deep love for religion and a significant desire to see our denomination move forward in ministry. An attorney friend of Mr. Feinberg's who's a member of a UMC in Washington, D.C., was the person who asked him if he would help by mediating. Now, as undoubtedly you've heard, Mr. Feinberg's highly respected and mediated things like the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund, as well as the Agent Orange Victim Compensation Fund. And while this mediated agreement is usually referred to as the protocol, I'd like to share its full title because I believe it's a better descriptor of what it's about. Protocol of Reconciliation and Grace Through Separation. So following 8 whereas statements of principles that basically state why this is needed, it moves into the articles themselves. I'm going to skip focusing on the whereas statements and move to the articles. I have a hunch, because you're all here, you know why it's needed. Article 1 outlines the agreement and commitment to the protocol. It was agreed to unanimously, and the participants agreed to fully support it and recommend it to the General Conference coming up in May in Minneapolis. In addition, they will persuade other groups with which they're affiliated to support the protocol, even if they were previously involved in supporting other legislative plans. Point 2 states that the intent of the separation of restructuring of the church will multiply its mission. The participants have now worked to put together the actual legislation and any enabling legislation. The legislation was actually just released this past Friday. And if you would like to read the entire 33 pages of the legislation, don't laugh, Bob. You can see it at this website, www.gracethroughseparation.com. That's www.gracethroughseparation.com. The Michigan and Sierra Leone annual conferences have called special sessions to forward it so that it can properly go to the General Conference, since the usual deadline for submitting legislation was way back in September. They've agreed that this legislation can't be separated out into various parts, so that only some pieces of it would be considered. Now, actually, this is very important because of how the traditional plan back in February had a number of parts which were declared unconstitutional by our Judicial Council, and yet the entire plan was not then declared to be out of order. And so, therefore, we were stuck with, well, my perspective, we were stuck with the parts that did pass. The participants also agreed that they would not make claims for additional assets than what is stated in the protocol. Article 2 goes on to define terms and points out that after separation there will be new Methodist denominations, and also the post-separation United Methodist Church. And remember, those outside the U.S. are in the Central Conference. In the U.S., it's believed that the traditionalists tied to the Wesleyan Covenant Association will leave and start a new Methodist denomination. There may also be additional traditionalist denominations started. There's also the possibility that a liberationist group, not yet formally formed, may leave and start a Methodist denomination. In order to form another Methodist denomination, the minimum number of churches needs to be 100, and there are additional qualifications that must be met. These groups would basically start all over as a denomination, leaving the current administrative structure behind. In reality, the vast majority of the current United Methodist Church in the U.S. would remain post-separation. Article 3 states the process and timeline. Groups would have to register their intent to form a new denomination before May 15th of 2021. Central conferences, by a 2/3 vote, would have until December 31st of 2021 to leave the UMC and go with another newly formed denomination. By July 1st of 2021, annual conferences can choose to leave the UMC if 20% of their delegates agree to hold that vote, and then if 57% vote to leave. Now, I'm going out on a limb here, but I would almost guarantee that this is not something our Wisconsin Annual Conference would do, and that we would remain in the post-separation UMC. Any local church that would like a different affiliation than its annual conference can vote to leave. If a church is content to be in the denomination of the annual conference, then it doesn't need to vote. If it wishes to vote to join another new Methodist denomination, the local church council decides if it's to be a simple majority of members present and voting, or 2/3 present and voting at a special church conference meeting. Churches have a rather long timeline. They have until December 31st of 2024 for this. So, for example, if the Wisconsin Annual Conference does not hold a vote, it would remain in the post-separation UMC. First Church would not need to vote, and then would remain in the UMC, the post-UMC if they wished. Article 4 talks of the financial agreement. Basically, annual conferences and local churches keep their property, their assets, and their liabilities. The trust clause is not enforced. Now, the trust clause is what's included in the deeds of United Methodist Churches and states that all property is held in trust for the denomination. Property of those churches who leave will instead be held in trust by their new Methodist denomination. That's essentially to, should I say the word penalize? I think I will. Penalize any of what I would call the megachurches who decide that they'd rather be independent and go off and not be Methodist anymore, because they will have to pay a lot of liability. Now, in addition, $25 million will be paid to the new traditionalist Methodist denominations over a 4-year period. If there is more than one, then it will be split according to their total memberships. $2 million will be available to potential additional non-traditionalist Methodist denominations for a 4-year period. If there's more than one denomination who are non-traditionalists, then the General Council on Finance and Administration, in conjunction with the leaders of those denominations, will determine how the seed money is split. $39 million will be allocated in recognition of the historical role of the Methodist movement in systems of systematic racial violence, exploitation, and discrimination. These monies will be used to strengthen ministries by and for Asian, Black, Hispanic, Latino, Native American, and Pacific Islander communities, as well as African University. This $39 million comes about by the traditionalists foregoing an additional $13 million beyond their $25 million, and the post-separation UMC contributing $26 million over an 8-year period. The pension plans, dear to my heart, for lay and clergy remain in place. They'll be held by Westpath, our pension board, and all liabilities, in other words, unfunded liability, if there is any, will follow annual conferences and local churches who leave the UMC to go to their new Methodist denominations. Current boards and agencies like UMCOR, General Board of Global Ministries, Board of Church and Society, etc., will remain with the UMC. Likewise, will all their assets. And perhaps here is where I'll interject to say that in light of the amount of assets our boards have, it seems to me that paying the traditionalist $25 million is not an exorbitant sum. For example, there were $621 million in net assets for those boards and agencies at the end of 2018, according to the audit report of the General Counsel on Finance and Administration. Article 5 contains an agreed-to moratorium on all administrative or judicial processes related to restrictions in the Book of Discipline relative to self-avowed practicing homosexuals or same-sex weddings. These are to be held in abeyance. Now, many bishops have actually already agreed verbally to this moratorium, including our own bishop, way back at annual conference in July when he stated there would be no church trials in the Wisconsin Conference. Bishops would put any processes in abeyance. Article 6, it was hoped that the post-separation UMC could meet immediately following General Conference in May as a regional conference to take the restrictive language related to LGBTQ+ out of the discipline. However, that timeline can't happen because the regional conference, which is what the U.S. would hopefully become, making therefore its own changes to the Book of Discipline, will need to be approved by every annual conference since it's a constitutional change. And that amendment process will take 18 months. So the earliest would be January of 2022. Therefore, if you're looking at the protocol, Article 6, points 5 and 6 won't appear in this new legislation because it would be unconstitutional. The other points state that financial implications and judicial council review will happen. Usual thing. I should point out that the protocol has received very widespread support across the church, far more than any other previously submitted plan. But the other plans do still exist in legislation that will go before the General Conference. But it seems that the primary focus will now be on the protocol. Now, I know my clergy colleagues who are a part of our congregation may want to know how this affects them. If a clergy person, active or retired, wishes to transfer their membership from the post-separation UMC to a new Methodist denomination, they have until July 1st of 2021 to inform their bishop. If the annual conference remains in the UMC and clergy wish to remain, then you don't need to do anything. As for clergy candidates in the ordination process, and I know we have at least one here, right? Two, see, that's why I'm checking. We have two. If they were to wish to go to a new Methodist denomination, they're grandfathered in so that wherever they are in their process now goes with them to the new denomination. So that's an overview of the protocol of reconciliation and grace through separation. Let's see, Mark or other members of the task force, is there anything you'd like to add about the protocol before we open it for questions?
Only that there is no...
I think we have people with mics.
Connie's got a microphone.
Okay.
Only that there is no assurance through any of this that the actual language will be taken out. It has to be voted on in a general conference, and it may be voted down, and we may still be in the position after the deadline has happened that says, no, I'm sorry, but we still discriminate against gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender and queer people.
That's true. That's a valid point. Well, I think we're open to questions.
Great. Paul?
There's one in the,
I was just going to introduce Paul and Connie have microphones for questions, and Fran and I will attempt to answer them, or you can talk to each other, which is always quite nice. And we also have, Leslie has consented to be our timekeeper, so we know how long we have left, because there is an 11:15 worship service in this space, and we want to give enough time to turn that. So we've got about 18 minutes, and there are questions that will come.
A question I didn't see answered in my own conference's materials about the 25 million. It might help to know how they arrived at that figure and exactly what it was for.
well, they arrived at the figure, first of all, by looking at the total net assets, for one thing. And then the other thing was there was a balance, as in every negotiation, and the traditionalists wished that the vote for people to leave, including annual conferences, would be at just one vote over 50%, a majority. But they also wanted more money. So that was the balancing of getting more votes in percentage and giving more money. That was part of the negotiation.
And what it's to be used for, is that designated with the 25?
It's seed money to basically do a startup structure. So because they aren't taking any other general, what would be a new general conference or annual conference, is not taking any of the boards and agency or structure with it. And so my sense is it's seed money to begin that. Is that what you distill out of this?
I think they get to decide how they're going to use it,
Yeah.
quite honestly.
No, it's okay. If you could identify yourselves when you do that, that was Jim, because I can't even see back there. You're in the light, Jim. It's fine. Whose membership is in Northern Illinois, so that was the conference he was referring to. Mary Lou, go ahead.
Mary Lou Taylor. I'm interested if you know anything about why any other denomination that might want to form gets to split $2 million. I understand that any liberationist denomination would be smaller than the traditionalists. But it seems to me that that you cannot start a denomination on $2 million, and that it's distinctly unfair for the people who are largely gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and queer, and they're being penalized where the traditionalists are being given quite a bit of money.
I don't have an exact answer, but I would guess, and then, well, I'll guess first. My guess is that it related to what kind of percentages they saw related to votes at General Conference this last time in February. That's my guess. The other part of that is Steve Zikoff next week is the perfect guy to ask that question to.
And given that, and I think Mary Lou is at the base of this issue, it's a perpetuation of one of the major problems of the church, which is if you have basically sublimated voices and made them illegal, then all of a sudden if you make those voices legal, they haven't developed a place at the table as strong. So I think part of your question is that very clear statement about how do we balance this really? And remembering that, I mean, we've likened this to the inclusion in the church of African Americans post-slavery, and it took a century even to get close. And clearly, in the $39 million that is being reserved, there's an acknowledgement it still isn't right. And so I think that voice is very clear and is part of this inequity. There's one here, and then Uma has a question there, Paul.
Donnelly Dinsmore. I'm wondering what the sense is about Central Conference and the calculus about if they stay, the implications for change of discipline. And then the second question is, with pensions staying, is there the thought that that would sunset and at a particular time there would be separate pension funds? You know, they stay in.
I don't think we know the answer to the second one, because what would happen is Westpath would continue to work with those other denominations and, you know, be paid accordingly. They'd be basically farming that out. Other denominations that form are able to contract, for example, with those general boards and agencies. So if they want to be part of UMCOR, they can pay and be part of UMCOR. So I'm not clear. Let's see. And the first question,
which is, I think, is part of your answer, Fran, which is why, how many ever years ago, it went from the General Board of Pensions and Health Benefits to Westpath, so that it wouldn't be in its title tied to the United Methodist Church, but it's been set up, if the legislation allowed, to do exactly what we face today. And what was the first part? Sorry, Donnelly.
Central conferences. That's a wild card. Nobody knows the answer to that yet. You know, the central conferences really like and cherish the name United Methodist Church and that recognition. The other reality is that that's where they get most of their money from, not the traditionalists.
Right.
With the forming of the regional conference, my understanding is that the central conferences have now, while they were against this previously, now believe that it would be okay to have the U.S. be their own regional conference and make their own decisions about some of the things related to the discipline. That's my understanding.
There's also this.
We had another question.
Okay, we'll go to that.
Uma, and I hope I'm misunderstanding. Maybe you can help me. So you're saying that the split will happen, or has happened?
No, the split has not happened.
Has not happened. Okay then. So
we don't know if it'll happen.
Don't know if it'll happen. Okay, so but you're saying that I still have to wait, even after all this time, to find out if I'm going to be incorporated into the church. Will I still be a member? Will I still be active? What?
You would still, any of you here?
As a lesbian.
Yeah. Okay, there are, I think, a couple different ways to answer this, but one is, if you're a member of this congregation, you're welcome. And I, frankly, would never see this congregation saying that you would not be. So in other words, I think this congregation would go with whichever, the post-separation UMC, that is open and welcoming, or some new Methodist expression that's open and welcoming. Does that make sense?
waiting to vote on,
Oh, it's a matter of what Fran was, can I?
Yeah, please.
What Fran was talking about, and I don't mean to lower this anxiety, but because it's a matter of the Constitution, it needs to go through not only the vote of the General Conference, but then it needs to be affirmed by every annual conference that stays within the United Methodist Church for the change to be made. Is that exactly
Right.
right? So there is a sense that those who are not wanting to be inclusive will leave, but there still is that lag of time, so it gets through all of the annual conferences to vote. Because it's constitutional. It's the same thing that happens in the United States. If it has to go, it has to go to all of the states to ratify it.
Did that answer your question? Okay.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Art, my understanding is not that if we ratify this, if all the annual conferences ratify this, then the United Methodist Church is no longer discriminatory. It means the Book of Discipline is still in place, and we have to re-vote
And
at
can
the
be
next
changed.
General Conference,
That's correct.
which is at least 4 years away.
That's right.
Or
Or we
a
call
special
a-
annual
or we call a
conference could be
special.
called for that purpose and probably would be.
And if all of the central conferences are still in, we have no assurance that this will pass to change these votes. It's not in any of this proposed legislation that we become an open and affirming United Methodist Church.
But if we look at the number of annual conferences, the central conferences there are very few central conferences in the whole annual conference total. But it's not by delegates, it's by annual conference.
That's only to ratify this proposal.
Correct.
I'm talking about changing the Book of Discipline, the words in the Book of Discipline.
Oh, at that special general conference or another general I understand that.
There is no assurance that that language will be taken out.
That's true. Judy?
Judy Lyons, I'm just wondering if there is a summary like you worked with the articles, or do I have to read all 33 pages to get that summary?
I would
Before
just
next
say
week.
I gave you the summary.
Okay, it's not written anywhere.
It's on our website. It came out on the Thursday news.
There's an FAQ, Judy, that's a nice summary that's not 33 pages long, and there's a link to it from Mark's blog. So if you go to our website and read Mark's blog, and there's a link there to that FAQ that I found at least readable.
That's true, but it will not include what was included in the new legislation.
Do you have this in electronic form?
Yeah.
We can post it.
Okay.
We'll post it. I'll make sure it gets on Tuesday's e-news, and then we'll post it online on the website. Yep.
I believe in the KISS principle. Is there going to be a time when you're going to get this summarized down into about a 30-second explanation?
No.
of What members are going
No.
to read?
It's too complicated for 30 seconds
Why does it have to be so complicated?
because we're Methodists. Everything has to be methodical. Everything has to be legislative.
I give up.
Sorry. It's far too complicated to get to that.
So we've got about 5 minutes left. Thank you, Leslie, for that. Are there other questions?
I've got one more comment. I don't need the microphone for it. That is, why do we need to have a Jew tell the Protestants what to do?
Well, since we were Jewish first and Jesus was a Jew, I think that's pretty good. Okay.
There's one, Paul?
So let's, maybe we could just play out, understand the anxiety that exists with what would occur following if this is successfully passed, sets in motion activities, the final piece of which would not happen for, say, 18 months afterwards, right, because of the constitutional change. So we can all understand and appreciate the risk that that feels because of what it requires. So the question is one of intention. So given this, if this passes, play out what is at least the likely scenario in which, I'm trying to think about what a scenario would be in which those who want to be traditionalists would not go with the traditionalists, such that when you get to the time of a vote, it's pretty straightforward. So is there a scenario in which folks would want to hold on to and be part of the United, which is a little bit of an ironic now nomenclature? But by the way, PSUMC, post-separation United Methodist Church, I would not recommend adopting that.
Or the
okay,
WT, we tried.
We tried United Methodism? Yeah, okay, very good. So, but my question is just around what is the real likely risk, if you understand my question. In other words, given what this creates as an opportunity for folks to self-separate in effect, is there a high or even moderate level of risk that the Constitution would not be changed to strip and actually replace with affirming language 18 months down the road? And I know you can't answer with certainty, but at least from an anxiety standpoint, can you play out what is a likely scenario?
Go. You go first.
I'm trying not to be cynical, which is becoming very difficult, but after what I heard the preacher say this morning, I'd better stick to it. I think there is a place at which if this is going to go in a negative way, then it will go down as legislation, and we'll stay with what we've got now. And what we have now is going to precipitate a rupture in the church, which I think is catastrophic to everybody, which is why this, I think, was brought forward to move forward. One of the things is, and we've lived through this, do you blow it up in order to save it, which we've lived with several times in my lifetime, and some of you it's many more times than that. My sense is that the traditionalists will break off because they will get something out of that. Some of us resent that, whatever. They will get something. There is a preservation and the understanding, I think, of several of the central conferences is we've got to figure out how to live with a progressive American church, by and large, or that very key relationship will go down. So then we have some further work to do in terms of theological similarity. And although it is anxiety, I think it will go forward. But the critical issues that Mary Lou raises and that Uma voiced, we need to pay attention to not only at the general level of the church, but clearly here at the local level of the church, because as Fran said, this is not an abstract idea for us. This is where we live. And so we need to live with that and not take it for granted. But
Gail Anderson, first I would really like to thank Fran for distilling all this and explaining it so well. And second, I think we should all be grateful to Mr. Feinberg, who is a nationally renowned person, for using his time to mediate.
One more. Oh yeah, it was pro bono too.
Yeah.
Liz,
I'm just wondering,
two more. Okay, and then we're going to.
what's the difference between a constitution and a discipline? All I've ever heard of is a discipline. I didn't know we had a constitution. And then what is Westpac or something you keep talking about?
Good. That's great, Liz. I love that. When I taught polity, I used to give out, on the very first day of class, the vegetable soup of the United Methodist Church, and it ran to 75 acronyms. This is true, before they took the class, so it gets a little strange. The first thing is that The United Methodist Church, even back to 1784, was mimicking the United States. And therefore, what they decided to do was to create a constitutional church. So some theologians would say the church is not brought into being by a constitution. It's brought into being by God, and therefore by tradition. Except for in 1784, there was this brand new burst of energy, and the Constitutional Congress was going on, and we know it has problems, at least recently, because we rely on the Constitution itself, and so that's the bedrock of the discipline. When it goes to jurisdictional conference or council, which is like the Supreme Court, everything is not measured against Scripture or the canon law of the church, it's against the Constitution. So that's the difference. The discipline is the whole legislation, the Constitution, is like the American Constitution. Westpath is the General Board of Pensions, basically.
One last question.
Quick comment. Thank you for your leadership in helping us understand, and to the task force, and we look forward to hearing you next week. My own comment on the future title of the UMC is, I say we keep UMC, but use the most common typo and call it the Untied Methodist Church.
Oh, the EUB and
yes, yes.
You know, that United came from Evangelical United Brethren.
Yeah. Anyway. And the wonderful thing that was brought from the EUB was this sense of being together as one.
I think we would not be here at this juncture if the EUBs had prevailed.
I agree.
But that's
I absolutely agree.
Anyway.
Yeah. Would you please, we have so many gifts, both lay and clergy, and Fran vowed, I think, and it was a marital vow and a personal one. When he retired, he was going to retire, but he has given a great deal of effort and energy to this, and would you thank him? And this is just a personal comment, and then we will close. One of the wonders of this church is that this is not a church that feels isolated and away from what's going on in the rest of the denomination. But for me, some people ask, how is the Wisconsin Annual Conference? Because these are folks from New England and Northern Illinois. And I said, I worship with the Wisconsin Annual Conference every single week as it gathers here in this sanctuary. Not only our colleagues who are ordained and part of that, but we have people who have given their lives and much of their life as lay people to the future of the greater church, but also invested right here. And I think of our dear friend Lee Roberts, who we will memorialize next week, who, I read his obituary and knew him, and the bishop sent a testimonial to him. It puts most of us to shame in terms of what we've been able to do. This church is the church in many, many ways. And when Fran says, this will not happen here, I took a vow to you after the February debacle in St. Louis, and I mean it for it to be true. Wherever that lands us, it is true that what we have together is, from my perspective, truly EUB, truly Methodist, and it is what binds us together in the heart and to God. And so let us pray for each other. We are salt and light. Blessings to you all. And if you're staying for 11:15, I hear that the prelude begins almost immediately. So it's good to see you. And thank you to the team, the technical team. Thank you. Travel well. That was great.